Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Friday, January 30th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. In Riverside, expect a pleasant high of 80.2 degrees today, with the mercury dropping to a comfortable low of 55.7 degrees overnight. Perfect weather for getting out and about. Coming up on the show, we'll unpack the motivations behind President Trump's pick of Kevin Warsh to lead the Federal Reserve next. We'll also examine the circumstances under which bits of marijuana in a car could trigger a legal search in California. And we'll cover other key developments making headlines today. All this and more, right here on Alex's News. Stay tuned. We start this half hour with a big move out of Washington on the economy. President Trump has tapped Kevin Warsh to run the Federal Reserve. Ethan, walk us through what the White House did this morning.
The president made it official this morning, posting on Truth Social just after 9 Eastern that he's nominating Kevin Warsh to replace Jerome Powell as Fed chair. He called Warsh, quote, very respected and from central casting, end quote, and signaled he expects him to cut interest rates aggressively. NPR and CNBC both described this as a pivotal moment in a long, very public clash between the White House and the central bank. It comes with Powell still in office, and with a Justice Department criminal probe into Powell hanging over everything.
So who is Kevin Warsh, and why is this pick getting so much attention?
Warsh is a former Fed governor who joined the board back in 2006 under President George W. Bush when he was just 35, the youngest ever in that role, according to CBS News. He served through the 2008 financial crisis, helping set policy during some of the most turbulent years for the economy in modern times. Since then, he's been at the Hoover Institution, lecturing at Stanford, and he worked with billionaire investor Stanley Druckenmiller at Duquesne Family Office. The Guardian points out he was long seen as a hawk who favored higher rates, but lately he has been sounding a lot more like President Trump, criticizing the Fed's, quote, credibility crisis, end quote, on inflation and calling for lower rates.
You mentioned this has been building for months. How did we get to Warsh as the final choice?
The president himself has called it a 5-month odyssey. According to CNBC and NPR, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent led a quiet search that started in late summer of last year and looked at around 11 candidates, including current Fed Governor Christopher Waller and a top BlackRock executive, Rick Ryder. Trump also floated 2 insiders he called the two Kevins, Kevin Warsh and his National Economic Council Director, Kevin Hassett. In a Reuters interview earlier this month, he praised both, but signaled Hassett should stay put, which left Warsh as the leading contender.
There were a lot of leaks and speculation this week. How did the final hours before the announcement play out?
CNBC reports Warsh was seen at the White House yesterday, which really set off the rumor mill. A spokesman, Kush Desai, tried to tamp things down, calling the speculation a waste of everyone's time. But prediction markets like Kalshi had already shifted hard toward Warsh by last night, treating him as the prohibitive favorite. By the time the Truth Social post went up this morning, markets and most political watchers were expecting his name.
You mentioned this is happening against the backdrop of a feud with Jerome Powell. What's the heart of that conflict?
President Trump actually appointed Powell back in 2017, but their relationship has deteriorated sharply. Over the past year, according to CBS News, Trump has repeatedly blasted Powell as a stubborn mule and, quote, Mr. Too Late, end quote, because he thinks the Fed is not cutting interest rates fast enough. Trump has talked about wanting rates as low as 1% to stoke growth, especially as his tariffs have added to inflation pressures. Powell, meanwhile, has insisted that the Fed must follow the data and stay independent of politics, even as he acknowledges the political heat.
And now there's this criminal investigation into Powell. How did that start, and what exactly is being probed?
Earlier this month, in early January, the Justice Department opened a criminal probe focused on whether Powell misled Congress about a massive renovation of the Fed's Washington headquarters. The case is being overseen by U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro in the District of Columbia, which is notable because she's a prominent Trump ally. It all goes back to Powell's testimony in June of last year before the Senate Banking Committee, where he was pressed on whether the roughly $2.5 billion project was becoming a palace for Fed officials. He denied that under oath, and that's what prosecutors are now picking apart.
What did Powell actually tell senators about that renovation?
According to Fox Business and CBS News, Powell gave a very specific list of no's. He said there was no VIP dining room, no new marble, no special elevators, no roof terrace gardens, and no new water features or beehives. At the time, the criticism was that the renovation had gone from about $1.9 billion to roughly $2.5 billion, a $600 million increase. The Fed blamed that jump on nasty surprises in the nearly century-old buildings, like asbestos and lead paint, plus higher post-pandemic construction costs.
And what are prosecutors saying contradicts that testimony?
Prosecutors point to documents the Fed filed in September 2021 with the National Capital Planning Commission. Those plans, which outlets like the New York Times and Lawfare have reviewed, describe an executive dining suite and private dining rooms on an upper floor, plus an extension of the governor's private elevator. They also note new domestic marble from Georgia for some replacements and additions, along with what are called vegetated roofs and a garden terrace. The Fed later argued that the so-called terrace is really a lawn over an underground garage, but critics say that still does not square neatly with Powell's absolute denials.
Is there evidence that this renovation really was a luxury boondoggle, or is it more complicated than that?
Construction experts quoted by Realtor.com and Economic Times say most of the cost overrun looks like typical big project pain, especially in an old, partially swampy site. They point to things like unexpected soil contamination and the need for blast-resistant security upgrades as legitimate, expensive surprises. Those experts have not found clear proof of a gold-plated makeover beyond some restored historical finishes that might look fancy but were already part of the original design. That's why so many legal scholars are saying the criminal probe feels less about marble and more about pressure over interest rates.
How are other former Fed leaders and legal analysts viewing this investigation?
Former chairs Ben Bernanke, Alan Greenspan, and Janet Yellen issued a joint statement, carried by PBS and CBS News, calling the probe an unprecedented attempt to weaponize prosecutors against a sitting Fed chair. They argue that using a contested reading of construction documents as a basis for potential criminal charges sets a dangerous precedent for political retaliation. Lawfare and the New York Times have both written that the investigation appears aimed at creating, quote, cause under the Federal Reserve Act's removal clause, which only allows the president to fire a governor for inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance. That has always been understood as serious misconduct, not a policy disagreement.
Given that, how does Warsh's nomination fit into the legal chessboard around Powell's job security?
If prosecutors could show Powell lied under oath, that could be framed as malfeasance and used to justify firing him. That in turn would open the door for Trump to try to install Warsh more quickly, potentially even in an acting capacity, though that is heavily contested. Legal scholars like Peter Conti Brown and Lev Menand, writing in the Yale Journal on Regulation, say it risks turning the four-cause standard into a tool for punishing independent regulators over policy. They warn that could start a retaliatory cycle where presidents from both parties go after central bankers they do not like.
How is the Senate reacting to Warsh's nomination on top of this probe?
The Senate was already on edge. Republican Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina and Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, both on the Banking Committee, have said they will block all Fed nominees until the legal fight around Powell is resolved, arguing that the Justice Department's credibility is at stake. On the left, Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren has described the whole process as a hostile takeover of the Fed and wants nominations paused until the probe ends. So you have members of both parties worried, which means Warsh is stepping into a confirmation process that could be very slow and very ugly.
And structurally, who actually controls the Fed board right now, before any change?
Only 3 of the 7 board seats were originally filled by Trump, while the others came from the Biden years, including Powell's renomination. That mix has generally backed Powell's cautious path of gradual rate cuts, rather than the dramatic slashing the president wants. There is also a short-term board member, Stephen Miran, whose seat expires tomorrow, January 31st, adding one more moving piece. On top of that, a Supreme Court case called Trump versus Cook argued just last week. will determine how hard it is for the president to fire another Biden-appointed governor, Lisa Cook.
Tell us more about that Supreme Court case and why it matters here.
In Trump versus Cook, the president is trying to oust Governor Lisa Cook over alleged misstatements on mortgage disclosures, something she denies. SCOTUS blog and The Guardian report that, based on the justices' questions last week, the court seems inclined to preserve strong for-cause protections for Fed governors. That would reinforce an earlier decision, Trump versus Slaughter, from late May last year, which allowed temporary removals while a case is litigated but did not change the underlying standard. A final ruling, expected this summer, will either shore up or weaken the Fed's ability to resist political purges.
Let's talk markets. How did investors react once Warsh's name was out there this morning?
Markets were volatile but not panicked. CNBC says Treasury yields jumped as traders bet that Warsh, who has criticized the Fed's giant balance sheet, may move faster to shrink it, even if he cuts short-term rates. The dollar strengthened against major currencies, while gold dropped about 3% to around $5,200 an ounce, and Bitcoin slid below roughly $82,000. Stock index futures for the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq were down about 0.5%, reflecting concern but also relief that Trump did not choose someone with less experience.
And what are financial experts saying about Warsh himself as a potential chair?
On CNBC's Squawk Box, investor David Bahnsen called Warsh a safe choice who has, quote, the respect and credibility of the financial markets, end quote. Larry Kudlow praised him as a hard money hawk, meaning someone who takes inflation seriously. But Michael Strain at the American Enterprise Institute warned that if Warsh looks like a White House sock puppet, the Fed's credibility could suffer badly. Analysts at Goldman Sachs, cited by The Guardian, think markets see him as moderate overall, assuming the broader Fed committee will check any extreme moves.
Beyond the personalities, what does this mean for the core idea of Fed independence?
Historically, the Fed's arm's-length relationship with the White House has been treated as a cornerstone of U.S. economic stability. There have been ugly episodes before, like President Lyndon Johnson reportedly leaning on Chair William McChesney Martin at his Texas ranch, or President Nixon privately pressuring Arthur Burns in the 1970s. But historians quoted by Time magazine and Economic Times say using a criminal investigation tied to congressional testimony as leverage is something entirely new. If that becomes a playbook, central bankers everywhere will worry that independent judgment now comes with legal risk.
The administration has also floated some bigger structural ideas about the Fed. What are those?
Some conservative legal thinkers, including at the Manhattan Institute, are talking about what they call monetary federalism combined with a strong unitary executive theory. In practice, that could mean trying to split the Fed's monetary policy from its regulatory and bank supervision work and then bring that regulatory piece more directly under the president's control. They point to a Supreme Court case from 2020, Sela Law versus CFPB, which weakened protections for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau director as a model. Critics say that would be a backdoor way to politicize not just rates, but also how big banks are policed.
If, despite all this, Warsh is confirmed, what kind of policy path might he try to set?
Warsh would inherit an economy where President Trump has talked about wanting 7% GDP growth, something economists say is extremely ambitious. To chase that, Warsh could push for faster rate cuts than Powell has been comfortable with, while simultaneously tightening up the Fed's balance sheet by selling assets or slowing reinvestments. He would still be bound by the Fed's dual mandate of maximum employment and stable prices, so he cannot just ignore inflation. But the tone and pace of decisions could change quickly, especially if Trump manages to replace more governors and build a loyal majority on the board.
And Powell himself, even if he loses the chair, could still be around, right?
That is right. Powell's term as chair ends in May of this year, but his underlying board seat runs until January 2028. So even if he is replaced as chair, or if the court swats down attempts to fire him outright, he could remain a powerful voice inside the Fed. That would create a somewhat awkward scenario, where the past and future of Fed policy are literally sharing the same table.
Finally, big picture, how do experts think this struggle could affect America's standing in the global financial system?
Commentators in Forbes, The Hindu, and Business Times Singapore warn that if the Fed starts looking like an arm of the White House, global trust in U.S. assets could gradually erode. Investors buy treasuries and hold dollars partly because they believe the Fed will put inflation control ahead of politics. If that confidence slips, borrowing costs could rise and financial volatility could increase, even if it does not happen overnight. That is why so many people say 2026 is shaping up as a regime change year for U.S. economic policy, no matter how Warsh's nomination ultimately plays out.
A lot of moving parts, and all of them important to anyone with a job, a mortgage, or a retirement account. Ethan, thanks for breaking it down for us. Our second story this morning is about a major change to traffic stops and marijuana in California. A new state Supreme Court ruling came down just yesterday. Chloe, walk us through what the justices decided.
Grace, the California Supreme Court issued a unanimous 7-0 decision in a case called Sellers v. Superior Court of Sacramento County. As Cal Matters explains, the court basically told police they cannot use every trace of marijuana in a car as an excuse to search the whole vehicle. Justice Goodwin Lowe wrote the opinion, and he framed it as updating search rules for the post-legalization world. The ruling tightens when officers can rely on California's open container laws to justify a warrantless search.
So at a basic level, what was this case really about? What question did the court have to answer?
The central question was, when officers see marijuana in a car, does that automatically count as an illegal, open container that lets them search everywhere without a warrant? According to the San Francisco Chronicle, prosecutors had argued that even loose crumbs on the floor were enough to open that door. The justices rejected that, saying these laws are meant to prevent people from getting high while driving, not to criminalize every speck of illegal substance. So they drew a much sharper line around when marijuana in a vehicle actually creates probable cause.
And they didn't just speak in general terms. They laid out a test. How does that new standard work?
Justice Leo set up a 3-part test, which legal sites like Justia and FinLaw have been breaking down. For marijuana to count as an illegal open container and justify a warrantless car search, all 3 things have to be true at the same time. First, there has to be a usable amount, not just residue. Second, it must be in what the court calls an imminently usable condition. And third, it has to be readily accessible to someone in the car so there is a realistic risk they could consume it while the vehicle is moving.
Let's slow that down a bit. What does the court mean by imminently usable? That sounds like the tricky part.
You are right. That is the key phrase. The opinion, which is posted on the state court's ca.gov site, says imminently usable means you could consume it with minimal effort right then and there. So a rolled joint on the console, a loaded pipe, or a vape pen that is ready to go would qualify. By contrast, LAist points out that crumbs scattered on the floor or loose flour that still needs grinding and rolling are not considered imminently usable, because you would have to do too much prep work to smoke it immediately.
The court used that vivid spilled beer analogy everyone's been quoting. How does that help explain the difference?
Justice Leo compared loose marijuana debris on a car mat to beer spilled on a floorboard. As the Chronicle reports, he said spilled beer is not in a drinkable state, and scattered cannabis is not in a smokable state. In both cases, he suggested they do not pose an immediate threat of intoxication behind the wheel. But an open can of beer, or a rolled joint sitting by the driver's hand, is like having the intoxicant imminently usable and obviously risky while the car is in motion.
All of this grew out of one traffic stop in Sacramento County. What actually happened in the Sellers case itself?
Back in 2021, deputies pulled over a car in Sacramento County for what Cal Matters describes as a minor equipment violation, not for bad driving or suspected impairment. The driver was nervous, which the court later called a very common reaction, and he denied having marijuana in the car. Officers then saw a rolling tray on the back seat and a tiny amount of marijuana crumbs and seeds that had been swept onto the rear floorboard, behind a passenger and out of reach. They used that to claim an open container violation and searched the car, ultimately finding a loaded, unregistered gun under the passenger seat.
So the gun is what this all turned on. How did that evidence become the focus of the legal fight?
The passenger, Davie Sellers, was charged over that firearm and moved to suppress it, arguing the search was unconstitutional. According to legal coverage on Met News and Legal Updates, a magistrate judge, the Sacramento Superior Court, and the 3rd District Court of Appeal all sided with prosecutors, saying the crumbs, the tray, and the nervous behavior added up to probable cause. The Supreme Court reversed every one of those rulings. It said the search was illegal because the marijuana did not meet the new 3-part test, so the gun evidence had to be thrown out.
You mentioned nervous behavior and that tray. What did the justices say about those kinds of factors officers often rely on?
Justice Leo was blunt. He wrote that being nervous when pulled over is, quote, a natural reaction, end quote, and should not carry much weight by itself. The rolling tray, according to summaries on Find Law, was treated as legal paraphernalia that people are allowed to own under California's legalization measure, Proposition 64. Without signs of recent smoking, impairment, or a truly accessible, ready-to-use stash, the court said those details could not turn a legal situation into probable cause for a fishing expedition.
That brings us to Proposition 64 more broadly. How does this ruling fit into what voters approved back in 2016?
Proposition 64 legalized recreational marijuana for adults over 21, up to about an ounce of flower or a smaller amount of concentrate. Importantly, it also included language in the Health and Safety Code saying lawful marijuana activity cannot be the basis for detention, search, or arrest. Justia's analysis notes the Supreme Court leaned heavily on that clause, warning that treating stray crumbs as contraband would, in their words, effectively recriminalize legal possession. CalMatters adds that civil rights groups see this as closing a loophole that allowed police to use marijuana as a pretext, especially in communities of color already subject to disproportionate traffic stops.
Okay, let's talk about what this means for ordinary drivers listening this morning. If someone has legal marijuana in their car, what changes after this decision?
For adults carrying legal amounts, the big shift is that simple possession by itself is much less likely to justify a search. A sealed container in the trunk was already fine, but now even small, unsealed amounts that are not prepared for immediate use and not within easy reach should not trigger the open container rule. According to defense attorneys quoted by Cohen Defense and Los Angeles criminal lawyer, the smell of old marijuana or the sight of a baggie in a backpack no longer automatically opens the door to rummaging through the whole car. That said, the court stressed this is not a free pass. If there are signs you are actually using marijuana while driving, officers still have tools to investigate.
So what still can lead to a search? What are the situations where officers are still on solid legal ground?
Think about items that are clearly ready to go and right next to the driver or passengers. A half-smoked joint in the cup holder, a loaded vape pen sitting on the console, or a pipe that is packed and warm to the touch. Those all look imminently usable, and the court says that can justify a search under the open container laws. LAist also points out that if an officer smells freshly burnt marijuana, sees bloodshot eyes or slow reactions, and maybe observes a bad field sobriety test, they still have probable cause to investigate a drugged driving offense. And if someone is under 21, or obviously carrying more than the legal amount, none of this protection applies because that is still illegal under California law.
You mentioned smell, which has been a big issue. Did the court change how the odor of marijuana factors into these encounters?
Not entirely, but it did refine things. Earlier cases like People v. Hall said the odor of marijuana alone, especially if it seems stale, is not enough in a world where possession is largely legal. The seller's opinion, as the San Francisco Chronicle notes, reinforces that idea and effectively requires what some lawyers call a +1, something more, like visible, ready-to-use cannabis, or clear signs of impairment. So smell can still play a supporting role, especially if it is clearly recent smoke, but officers now have to connect it to actual impaired driving or another specific crime, rather than treating it as a blanket permission slip.
Not surprisingly, law enforcement groups are pushing back. What are prosecutors and police organizations saying about this ruling?
The California District Attorneys Association and police groups like PORAC have criticized the decision in statements flagged by Justia and KYM Kemp. They argue it makes it harder to do proactive policing, pointing to the Sellers case itself, where a loaded gun in what they describe as a high-crime area is now inadmissible. Some prosecutors say the three-part test is squishy, especially the imminently usable piece, and that it second-guesses officers' real-time judgment about whether loose marijuana can quickly be rolled and smoked. They also worry it will chill DUI enforcement at a time when, as several outlets have reported, marijuana-related crashes in California have risen since legalization.
And what are civil liberties and defense advocates saying in response to those safety concerns?
Groups quoted by Cal Matters and LAist counter that public safety cannot rest on what they call pretextual stops and hair-trigger searches. They point out that racial disparities in traffic enforcement are well documented, and that turning every trace of marijuana into probable cause disproportionately harmed Black and Latino drivers. Defense attorneys argue that nothing in this ruling stops officers from going after genuinely impaired drivers. It just forces them to look for real evidence of impairment instead of relying on crumbs. In their view, the court is simply aligning day-to-day policing with what voters thought they were approving when they legalized recreational cannabis.
What about officers on the road right now? How quickly will this change their training and what they actually do at a traffic stop?
According to early guidance discussed on Cap Central and in the Daily Journal, departments and highway patrol offices are already drafting new training bulletins. Agencies will have to retrain officers to document specific, concrete signs of impairment or illegal conduct, rather than writing observed marijuana as a catch-all justification. It also means supervisors and courts will be scrutinizing reports more closely to see if they meet that three-part test. The ruling took effect immediately, so as of today, any search relying on an open container theory has to follow these new standards.
California has been wrestling with these questions for years. How does this fit with earlier marijuana search rulings we have seen in the state?
It is very much part of a trend. Legal analysts on sites like GMSR note that cases such as People v. Johnson and People v. Fuse had already chipped away at the idea that any marijuana smell or sight equals probable cause. Sellers goes further by giving officers and judges a clear framework: usable quantity, imminently usable, readily accessible, and tying it tightly to the goal of preventing impaired driving. It does not overturn those earlier decisions. It builds on them and clarifies how the post-Proposition 64 landscape should work in practice.
There's also that federal wrinkle, where marijuana is still illegal nationwide. Did that come up around the gun they found in this case?
It did, at least in the background. Some prosecutors quoted in the Metropolitan News Enterprise pointed out that, under federal law, mixing firearms and any illegal drug activity can trigger serious charges, even if the state allows possession. But the California Supreme Court focused strictly on state constitutional protections against unreasonable searches and on what California voters enacted. Their view was that you cannot sidestep those protections just because an otherwise illegal item, like a gun, happened to be found after an improper search.
Finally, Chloe, what should people be watching for next as this ruling filters through the system?
In the near term, expect a wave of motions from defense lawyers asking judges to suppress evidence in older cases that look like Sellers, where searches were based on minimal marijuana traces. We are also likely to see some test cases as prosecutors and police probe the edges of what imminently usable and readily accessible really mean. And as LAist notes, other states that have legalized cannabis but still struggle with vehicle searches may look to this ruling as a model for their own courts or legislatures. Longer term, this decision cements California's move toward treating marijuana more like alcohol, focus on whether someone is actually impaired behind the wheel, not just whether they legally have the substance somewhere in the car.
A big shift for both drivers and police in California. Chloe, thanks for breaking that down for us. Here are some other headlines. On the prediction front, the odds makers are now the ones facing judgment. The prediction market platform Kalshi is fighting a blizzard of 19 federal lawsuits and multiple state-level actions over whether its event contracts are legitimate financial products or just sports betting in a necktie. A Massachusetts judge has issued a preliminary injunction barring Kalshi from offering sports-related contracts without a state gaming license, and regulators in Ohio and elsewhere are already cashing in on that ruling as legal precedent. Into this high-stakes hand steps new CFTC Chair Michael Seelig, abruptly scrubbing restrictive 2024 and 2025 proposals that would have banned sports and political contracts, instead promising clear rules for lawful innovation. With the Trump administration backing markets, DraftKings, FanDuel, and Coinbase all launching rival platforms, and a possible circuit split that could tee up a Supreme Court showdown by the end of 2026, the next 6 months will decide whether prediction markets trade coast to coast as financial assets or get fenced in as state-by-state gambling. To space, where the Artemis program is in full launch ladle mode, stirring up a new lunar era. NASA's Space Launch System rocket and Orion spacecraft are sitting at Launch Pad 39B after a January 17th rollout, as ground teams tick through a 48-hour countdown toward a critical, wet dress rehearsal on January 31st. The four-person crew, Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Canada's Jeremy Hansen, has been in medical isolation since January 23rd, all aiming for a February 6th liftoff. This 10-day engineering mission will send Orion looping around the moon, the first human visit to Lunar Neighborhood Watch since Apollo 17 in 1972. It's the dress rehearsal before Artemis 3, a final, crude test of life support and navigation systems, and a reminder that before astronauts can leave new footprints in lunar dust, they have to pass every check on NASA's to-do orbit. In Asia, Taiwan's economy is putting the gross domestic product in a good way. GDP for 2025 is estimated to have surged 8.63%, the fastest clip since 2010, with fourth-quarter growth blasting off at 12.7%. An unquenchable global thirst for AI hardware has exports of high-performance computing gear and semiconductors up nearly 35%, giving Taiwan a serious silicon swagger. Giants TSMC and Foxconn are logging record revenues from clients like NVIDIA and Apple, while a new trade deal with the Trump administration cuts U.S. tariffs on Taiwanese imports to 15% in return for a pledged $250 to $500 billion in American semiconductor and AI investments. Economists expect the boom to cool to between 3.5% and 5.1% growth this year, a reminder that even the hottest AI rally can't outrun gravity, and some fear this chip party could eventually bite back. Across the northern border, trade turbulence is reaching cruising altitude conflict. President Trump is threatening a 50% tariff on all Canadian-built aircraft sold in the U.S. and says he'll move to decertify Canadian planes already flying American skies. He calls it retaliation for Canada's refusal to certify business jets from Georgia-based Gulfstream Aerospace, zeroing in on rival Bombardier, whose global express line is now in the presidential crosshairs. Bombardier insists its jets meet all FAA standards, while aviation experts warn the president can't simply yank certifications that are legally in the FAA's cockpit. A full ban could ground hundreds of regional jets and disrupt U.S. military operations that rely on Bombardier platforms, turning an already bumpy week with Prime Minister Mark Carney amid wider clashes over China trade and regional separatism into a full-blown bout of industrial warfare. For Canada, this dispute could force a choice between regulatory runway rules and its largest export destination, and in Ukraine, a fragile freeze-fire may briefly thaw the weaponization of winter. President Trump says Vladimir Putin has agreed to a one-week pause on strikes against Kyiv and select cities, framed as a humanitarian gesture, as temperatures plunge toward minus 30 degrees Celsius, threatening millions already struggling for heat and water. The Kremlin confirms a limited pause focused on the capital, set to expire Sunday, February 1st. President Zelensky, wary of any quick-melt promises, has floated a reciprocal deal. Ukraine will hold back strikes on Russian oil refineries if Moscow keeps its hands off Ukraine's power grid. The plan reportedly emerged from trilateral talks in Abu Dhabi, offering a narrow but critical window that could spare civilians during the cold snap. Yet continued Russian shelling in southern regions, such as Odessa and Zaporizhia, underscores how thin this ice really is, more a humanitarian pit stop in the war than a lasting ceasefire. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King, with GPT-5, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.